confirmation about the audio, please, guys. If the audio is clear and available, kindly confirm. Thank you. We shall be starting in a couple of moments. So hello, a very good afternoon to all of you and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to another session of Environment and Ecology where we shall be proceeding ahead with the portion of biodiversity. And then as we move ahead, we shall be analyzing the other areas, for example, the protection measures, the various different principles involved, the aspects of wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, biodiversity reserves, and also biodiversity heritage sites is something that we will be taking a look at. And then we shall be analyzing how to cover the portion of the critically endangered species, something that oftentimes gives us nightmares overall. So those are the areas that we are going to cover. And then eventually we are going to come to the portion of international laws and conventions. And how is it that these international laws have been framed? What are the requirements of these international conventions when we talk about? And then we will also be discussing the portion of the previous year questions. So today we shall be taking up as many previous year questions as possible, the prelims previous year questions, also a couple of main type of previous year questions if we can. So that is what we are going to cover today. So till now, any issues that you have been facing in this particular portion of environment and ecology, any of the issues that you are confronted with, please let me know, or please let us know during the course of the session as well. Right? Initially, we have to choose important news in newspaper so that you don't have to do a selective analysis of that. So over a period of time, when you are regular with newspaper, this will come automatically for you. So when you have to take a look at the important news or the newspapers or the news articles rather which are relevant for your exam, judge it on the basic parameters that if it is relevant for your piece of information today, tomorrow, and something which is going to be relevant after 1 year also, that is something that you have to choose. For example, let's suppose any key legislation which has been passed. So analysis of that legislation, the pros and cons. Now that is something which will be important. Then, for example, let's suppose economic growth rate figures have been released. Now those economic growth rate figures, now those won't be relevant 1 year down the line. So while you can take a look at the larger picture, you don't necessarily have to drool much over what are the growth figures, what are the various different rates of inflation, etc. So there you don't have to rote learn. Okay, so just follow that. So now we start with the portion, or we will again repeat the portion of ecosystem engineers. Asif, I'm relying for current affairs on webinars and magazine and revising Thursday webinar. But that is fine, Asif, but I would still suggest to you, get into the habit of reading the newspaper. The revision of what you have studied in the newspaper can be done with the help of these webinars, can be done with the help of these analysis and the magazines, but get into a habit of at least looking through the newspapers. It will improve your own writing skill, it will improve your ability to look at the larger perspective, and the analysis that you end up making will be much more productive. Okay? These international conventions can be asked in the mains, can be produced in mains. Absolutely. You have direct questions which have been asked from the international conventions in the mains examination. So that is the point that you need to be aware of and take care of. Okay. So now we will again revise the portion of ecosystem engineers. I went through down to earth, everything seems relevant. So basically the relevance is, in terms of down to earth, the relevance is not only restricted to environment ecology, it is associated with the portion of geography as well, and many portions of current affairs. Some areas of science and tech are also covered. That is why down to earth magazine is such a great requirement. Should I rely on my own reading of newspaper or Byju's explanation of DNA? So do one thing. Ideally, I would suggest to you is that read the newspaper on your own and then take a look at the analysis video in order to have a better understanding of those viewpoints. Okay. See, even if you study or read through 2 articles, let's say a day, that also will be a good start. Initially, when you have the initiation, so it won't be that from day one itself you'll be able to cover the entirety of the newspaper. Initially, try to have a target that you cover 2 articles at least a day, then 3 articles, then the entire editorial, and then you can always revise with the help of the analysis. So I think those are the questions, right? So now we come back to the topic. I only read books which Byju's provide and read Hindu newspaper and practice. Should I listen to Hindu? If you are able to follow the portion of the Hindu newspaper and the books, and I hope you are able to revise the monthly magazines on a regular basis, so that would also more than suffice. Okay. Hawaii Island forest fire. Yes, the forest fire which has happened in Hawaii, that will not immediately end up threatening the corals, but then it can in the long run. It will not immediately, because when you have wildfires running through settlement areas, so there are a lot of toxins which are also released in the process, and they eventually leach into the sea, and that is where the damage comes from. Now, what do we understand by ecosystem engineers? So ecosystem engineers, these are those particular species who are able to modify their surroundings or modify their own biology in order to shape the ecosystem around them. So they are able to modify themselves and their surroundings in either of the cases. So they modify their habitats through their own biology or physically changing the biotic and abiotic factors of the environment. Now we have taken an example of this. Autogenic engineers, they modify their own environment by modifying their own biology. So what is the example of autogenic engineers that we took a look at? Can we recall? Autogenic engineers. They will be able to modify their own biology. So here, for example, we can take the case of, when we say autogenic, we can take the case or the example of trees. Now the trees are able to modify their own biology as they grow up. Modify themselves as they mature. And this modification shapes the ecosystem. Shapes the ecosystem. Okay. Then here when we talk about these trees, here the example is very simple. So when you have a small sapling of a plant, let's suppose you have a kind of a small sapling of a plant. Now at a stage when the sapling is very small, now there the type of species which inhabit this particular region will be very, very different. And as the sapling ends up growing significantly, as it grows and modifies itself into, let's say, a kind of a tree as it matures. Now, in that case, the various different types of biological systems, the abiotic factors, the biotic factors, the entire ecosystem and environment around them, that changes. So the type of species which will inhabit this particular landscape will be very, very different than the type of species that you will find in the case of a tree. So it is modifying its own biology, and that is how the ecology around it is changing. So this will be the example of an autogenic engineer, right? Autogenic ecosystem engineer. And allogenic engineers, they physically modify their environment, and there we have taken a look at beavers. Example, beavers. What do the beavers do? We have seen that the beavers are able to dam the fresh water. So in any particular area, let's suppose you have a kind of a river system which is flowing. Now the beavers, they do like fresh water. But at the time when they have to reproduce, when they require significant amount of nutrition and nourishment, and you require large amount of nutrient in the water, so fresh water generally doesn't have that much amount of nutrient count. So what they will do is they will build a dam. So by damming the river, they will end up creating a large area of comparatively static water pool. And there, the type of species which will come into existence, the type of plants which will start to grow, everything will significantly be changed. And the entire ecosystem in that area will experience a change. So beavers, they dam the flow of fresh water. Dam the flow of fresh water. Okay, now these are your basic ecosystem engineers. Now we also have invasive alien species. They are also oftentimes termed as ecosystem engineers because they themselves will also be able to modify their environment. And for their competitors, for the local species, for the indigenous species, that creates significant amount of various issues. Okay, so here, for example, we can take the case of eucalyptus. As it grows and matures, it will modify the ecosystem, whereby in the ecosystem you don't have any kind of, or the moisture level in the ecosystem generally comes down, because these invasive species, they are good at absorption of moisture. So yeah, absorb moisture. Okay, make the area dry. That is how they can basically put a change to the ecosystem in which they are living. Now we come to the various different causes which leads to the loss of biodiversity in areas around us. How is it and why is it that we experience, or we are basically witnessing a significant loss of biodiversity? So here, there are various different reasons for them. Now, we can basically categorize these reasons into certain particular classifications. So first is habitat loss and fragmentation and degradation of the habitat. Now let us understand each of them. So what do we mean when we say loss of habitat? So imagine, let's suppose you have a species which lives particularly in forests. Now in those species, if you have a particular species which lives in forest, and the forest is deforestation happens in that region, or the trees are cut, so obviously the species in that case, they don't have any habitat to survive, right? So deforestation, construction activities, so that is something which is leading to encroachment in the natural habitats. And there you can always have natural factors, natural causes for habitat loss. That can be, for example, rise of seawater in certain cases. That can be categorized into rise of seawater or sea level. It can be even in the case, let's suppose, forest fires or volcanic activity. Okay, these will bring a significant loss of habitat in the natural scenario. Now, also unusual amount of flooding, that can also bring or disrupt a habitat. Other than that, you also have the anthropogenic causes, or the human-induced factors. Anthropogenic. Now, these anthropogenic factors can include, yes, very good. Basically, let's suppose construction activities. Let's suppose we talk about urbanization, deforestation, oil spills, good, pollution, right? So these can be, now in construction, you can have various different types of construction, right? In pollution also, you can account for various different types of pollution, which will, in a way, create a loss of habitat for the natural ecosystem. Then we have what is the fragmentation and degradation of the habitat. Now, what do we mean by fragmentation and degradation? Fragmentation basically means that the existing habitat or the existing biodiversity setup, that is then broken into many smaller parts or subparts. So this is where the existing habitats get subdivided. And this happens due to generally the human-based or human-induced factors. Human-induced factors. So here, for example, let's suppose you have the existence of a larger habitat here. Let's suppose. Narendra, the question either in air or from soil is something. Eucalyptus absorbs moisture from soil, Narendra. It generally creates the, now if you start absorbing moisture from the soil significantly, the soil will absorb moisture from the air, so it overall creates a dry condition. Okay, it is a cyclic process, and it creates conditions which are very prone to droughts. So let's suppose you have a habitat, a large habitat. Now a large habitat is very much required for species who have a bigger range of movement. So for example, you have, let's suppose, tigers, let's suppose even if you consider elephants, now they generally end up moving through a very large area. So, and they move through a large area because that is where they get their food, that is where they get access to water, that is where they get access to fresh grass, green grass, etc., depending upon the type of species that we are talking about. Now if you have a construction activity which goes on, and if let's suppose there's a construction which goes on in a different manner here, if let's suppose you have constructed a highway, a railway, now in this case, look at the size of the habitat which is left. Now that size of the habitat, now that is not enough for the accumulation of sufficient amount of species. So what it will lead to? Reduced aerial spread. Reduced aerial spread means greater amount of competition for the same amount of resources. So that can lead to, in a significant way, due to competition, lack of resources, the extinction of the species. Many of the species can be pushed to the verge of extinction because of that. So when we say fragmentation, reduces the area available when the area available reduces, as a consequence, what do we have is greater competition for resources, and that will lead to threat to biodiversity. Threat to biodiversity. Okay, that is the resultant or the outcome of the fragmentation. Then we have the process of degradation. So when we say degradation, so degradation of a habitat means the quality of the existing habitat will also reduce. The quality of the existing habitat in order to produce the better quality of food, nutrients, etc., the wide variety of the sources of nourishment, everything that starts taking a hit. So this will degrade the existing quality of the habitat. The existing habitat deteriorates. Okay. Now, here, this also, when you have a habitat loss, now where will the species go? In many of the cases, when you have habitat loss or the fragmentation of habitat or even the degradation of the existing habitat, the species, they have lesser area for their own survivability. They are oftentimes forced to find newer landscapes. So this is something which oftentimes instigates a significant man-animal conflict. And man-animal conflict is always detrimental because animals, they don't want to get in conflict with humans at all. Animals are, regardless of the various different misconceptions which prevail, but the animals, they are not interested in having human flesh, etc. So they don't want to venture into human territories or human areas because, understand, animals are as territorial as we are. Just like we don't like anybody coming into our territory, similarly is the case with them as well. And also, they also don't want to venture into a territory which has been marked by the other organism or the other animal. So that is where deliberately or in a way of no other option left, they are forced to enter into human habitations, and that always leads to man-animal conflict. Okay, so this leads to man-animal conflict. Now, here, the other role or the other threat that the biodiversity faces is the invasive alien species. Invasive alien species are what? The species which are not naturally to be found in an area. They are not natural to a particular region. Okay, none of these species, they are natural to an ecosystem or a particular area. But then these particular sets of species, they end up modifying that ecosystem, and they have a very faster rate of reproduction. They have a very fast metabolism, very fast rate of growth, and they put the indigenous species in danger. Okay, so here they have very fast rate of growth. Then British forcefully introduced invasive alien species. They did, but it is not as if that after the Britishers left, we have not been introducing them. Even after that, we have been introducing a lot of invasive alien species in our ecosystem. You have many of our urban areas where people import exotic species of, for example, turtles, and they import them, and when they start growing larger, then they cannot manage them anymore, so they openly leave them in the wild, and they simply release them in the wild. Now that causes a havoc in the local environment and ecosystem. Also, many of the ornamental plants that people get in. Now those ornamental plants, people initially in few of the urban centers, they start importing them, and once it happens, then there is nothing stopping them. So it is not as if only the Britishers did all the wrong. They did the wrongs, but then we Indians, we have continued with those wrongs as well, and that is something we have to own up. So very fast rate of growth, outcompete the rivals for resources. Okay, they are more resilient to certain threats as well, and that is where the indigenous species, they get hampered and they get damaged. We have taken a look at few of the examples of invasive alien species, the examples of them. So you can have Lantana camara, we can have Senna spectabilis, then you can have water hyacinth. You have certain species of turtles as well. Then you have such examples prevalent across. One of these examples is the case of the Burmese python. And also in the case of Colombia, we have the case of rhinos as well. So it does not mean that any particular species has to be for a particular category for them to be categorized as invasive alien. Any species which is not naturally found in an ecosystem, that is alien to that ecosystem. Now, when we talk about that particular ecosystem, so there you have a significant amount of damage which is created. Why? Because of those particular species and how those particular species end up interacting, how those particular species end up behaving. So here you can take the case of the Burmese python. Now, the Burmese python, they have been introduced into the region of Florida. Now, Burmese python, obviously, the name itself is self-telling that when we say a Burmese python, it is typically to be found in the region of Myanmar and Burma. So in those areas, you have these pythons, their range restricted due to the vegetation and also the availability of resources, because there are multiple different competitors for the resources that the pythons consume, that is the small rodents, etc. Now, that is how the pythons and their population oftentimes is kept in check. Now, what was done was that in the Everglades region of Florida. Now, Florida is a warm area. It is a tropical region, southeastern part of the United States. Now, that is where you have one of the largest wetlands of the world, what is referred to as Everglades. Now, Everglades is a kind of a marshy tract, some things that pythons absolutely enjoy, right? Small amount of water which is there, and there is a lot of plant and vegetation in which they can hide within that water itself, so where they won't be very easily spotted by the various different types of prey that they consume. So that is the kind of foliage, that is the kind of an ecosystem that the pythons, they do like. Now, in the region of Florida, the farmers, they face significant amount of problem due to the pest infestation and the rodent infestation. Now, that pest and rodent infestation would cause them substantial amount of loss in terms of crop output. Now, some bright individuals, they thought about a solution that why don't we bring these Burmese pythons and we will introduce them into our ecosystem so that they will eat those rats and those mice and our crops will be safe. Well, they did bring them in, and these pythons, they started feeding on these rats. Now here, the supply was still significant. But then, after a few years, you have to understand that the tropical regions, they are oftentimes prone to excessive amount of flooding. And this flooding is something which encompasses a larger area. So in the Florida region as well, you had these frequent floods. And these floods, introduced these pythons into the wetland ecosystem. They brought these pythons into the region of the wetlands. And that is where they got introduced into the Everglades wetland ecosystem. Now there, the species, they never had a kind of a predator like this for the smaller species. And that is where the pythons, they found endless supply of food with no competition. And they thrived. Their numbers exploded. Now, once the numbers will explode, what will the pythons do? They will try to explore newer areas. They will try to have or colonize newer areas. So that is where they started moving away. Few of them, they started moving away from these wetlands. And that is where they started consuming smaller domesticated animals for that matter. And these domesticated animals, one by one, they started being consumed by the pythons. Now, then people did realize that, okay, this is a kind of a menace that we are facing. Now that the pests and the rodents are gone, but we are faced with a newer problem. And that is when these particular pythons, now they are being hunted down. There is a kind of a reward which is set that you have to hunt it down. So when the invasive alien species, their number grows, they bring about a kind of a population interaction, which we have studied earlier as amensalism. What do we understand by amensalism? Where for one species, it grows significantly, but for the other species, it is detrimental. So this promotes amensalism. Okay, they end up promoting amensalism. Then the other threat, you have the threat of pollution as well. Now, pollution can lead to the degradation of the habitat. It can lead to the degradation of the existing habitat. Degradation of existing habitat. Okay. Then you have the impact of climate change. So climate change will also lead to the changes in the ecosystem, to the habitat. The ecosystem, it might not be as productive anymore. A video is not hidden, my dear friend. There is no point of hiding the video. So you please refresh it. The video will automatically appear. Okay. Please understand that we are not having these live sessions to hide the video from you. So you can refresh it and you can always get the video availability. So when you have the degradation of the existing habitat, so that can always impact the food chain, food network, also the energy pyramid, the amount of food which is available. So then when we say climate change also brings about the similar change. For example, rise of seawater. For example, it can also bring about changes in the freshwater ecosystem. It can make certain ecosystems much more saline. It can lead to significant repeated drought formations, due to which the underground species or the species, burrowing species, they get impacted. So they also change the existing habitats. The existing habitats. Then we have the diseases. So diseases also, they claim large amount of biodiversity in one swipe. So here we can take the example of the CDV. That is, you also, by the way, have certain diseases which can impact a large scale or which can end up creating a large scale coral bleaching also. Okay, so that is also a real term possibility that you have certain diseases which can initiate or induce large scale coral bleaching. So here, when we talk about the diseases, you can talk about those factors also. Example we will take of canine distemper virus. Okay. Now this has impacted which particular population? We have talked about this in the last week, and this canine distemper virus has impacted which population? Which kind of species? Good, perfect. No, not cheetahs. It has impacted the lions, African lions. So in the 90s, in the mid 90s, around 1994, you had, I hope you are able to understand that you have, or we are aware that we have a very large area of protected region, that is the Serengeti, right? So Serengetis in Tanzania, they are a very large landscape for these various different species. So there you had around 1,000 lions which perished at one go because of this canine distemper virus. So imagine in a smaller landscape, if 1,000 lions, they perish in one go, what will be left of the biodiversity? So you can have the example of the Tanzania, or in the region of Serengeti. Tanzania. Okay. So that is where you had a large scale impact because of these viruses. Then after that, we come to IUCN, or International Union for Conservation of Nature. Now this IUCN, it was established in 1948. Okay, this was established in 1948. In 1948 in France. Okay, that is where it had been established. Now, here, this IUCN has consistently been involved in the activities in the various different processes, movements, mass awareness campaigns, etc. Anything associated with the conservation of nature has been something that the IUCN has been linked with. So that is where the IUCN, not only has it been a very ardent advocate for the nature and the nature conservation, but over a period of time, since 1964 onwards, it has been releasing what is referred to as the Red Book, or the Red List. Now, in that red list, you have the threatened species which are present. So that is the entire red list, in which IUCN classifies based upon the certain criteria. Obviously, it does classify the species into the categories, whether they are extinct in the wild, whether they are critically endangered, whether they are endangered, vulnerable, threatened. So that is the classification in general. So here, for example, extinct, not to be found anywhere anymore. Then, for example, you have extinct in the wild. For example, you have few of the species of turtles, large turtles, the older, like the Galapagos turtles. Now, they had been kept under conservation, a couple of species, but they were not to be found in the wild anymore. So that is the case of extinct in the wild, that only in the protected areas, to be found only in protected areas. Only under conservation. Okay. Then you have what is the critically endangered species. Those species whose numbers are dwindling really fast, and those particular species who require an urgent need for conservation, that is critically endangered. Then you have endangered, vulnerable. So overall, that as you move from this in this direction, the threat perception for the species increases. Perception for species increases. Okay, so that is what we refer to as the red list in general, and this is basically a creation of IUCN, and IUCN keeps on updating that list almost a couple of times every year. This list keeps on getting updated. Okay, so here, what are the criteria or the conditions for the classification in the categories of the IUCN? So if you will observe here, to be classified under the portion of critically endangered, that means critically endangered means there is a need to provide urgent amount of care. So how do you do that? So basically, first of all, analyze the population of it. So whichever species has observed a population decline of 80 to more than 90% either in the past 10 years or for their past 3 generations. Okay, so either in the past 10 years or their past 3 generations, if they have experienced a decline of 80 to 90%, right? So here, please understand the difference between 10 years or the 3 generations, whichever is longer. So you have certain species, for example, which have a shorter lifespan, few of the species which have a much longer lifespan. For example, certain species of turtles, they can live for 150 years. So there, how will you judge the decline in the number of species? You cannot judge them based upon only one generation. So wherever for the past 3 generations or 10 years, whichever is longer, there has been a population decline of 80 to or more than 80 to 90%. If that is the criteria, or if that is the condition, or if a population size of fewer than 50 individuals, if that is the condition, okay, population less than 50, or let's suppose there is a complete movement of, or a complete, let's suppose, end of a habitat where they are surviving, complete degradation or extinction of the habitat in either of these categories. Or let's suppose you have certain species where the reproduction is not happening because of climate change, because of the conditions that they have been faced with, the various fragmentation of habitat. Let's suppose they are experiencing the stress and the reproduction is not happening anymore. So there also you have the species classified under critically endangered. Okay, so this is one of the highest alert or the threat levels that is reached. Then you have endangered. Endangered, similarly, where the population size has been, or the population reduction has been around 50 to 70% of reduction. Okay, again in the same time period, either in the past 10 years or for the past 3 generations, and where you have lesser than 250 individuals or any other factor involved, there you will have the species being classified as endangered. Then you have the vulnerable species. Vulnerable, where a population decline of 30 to 50% over the past 10 years, fewer than 1,000 individuals or any other factor. So that is how the classification is done. And frequently, the species, their categorization is changed from one to another, depending upon their population, depending upon the threat perception, and depending upon what are the changes in their ecosystems or their natural numbers that they are experiencing. For example, if you take the case of snow leopards. Now, snow leopards, now, these are very elusive species. Elusive in the sense, it is not at all easy to spot them. It takes a significant amount of, greater amount of research, greater amount of exploration to be able to search one or the odd snow leopards. Also, because of the, for example, when you consider the camouflage of their skin and the backdrop that they live in icy cold regions, there also it isn't easy to spot them at all. So these snow leopards, which are also referred to as the ghosts of the wild, now earlier, because the individual numbers were so very few which had been cited, they had been put under endangered. Now, over a period of time, it was understood that these snow leopards, they live in a very large landscape, from the region, right from the area of Arunachal in the northeastern portion to the extent of northwestern portion of the Himalayas to the extent of the Central Asian mountains. So in that entire territory, in that entire region, you have significant amount of snow leopards. So once it was understood that their range is very large, now then it was also extrapolated to the fact that their numbers would also be significant. So they were then relegated to vulnerable. So that is how very frequently their positioning is changed. Now here, animals are listed in this red list, plants are listed in this red list, some birds are listed, marine species are listed, amphibians are listed, even fungal species, a few of the fungi, they are also listed to be endangered. So it is any species which is facing a threat of extinction. So that would be included in the IUCN. Any species facing a threat or declining population. Because the preconceived notion that majority of the candidates have is that when they talk about, let's say, these lists, now because they have heard about that, okay, Nanda for flying squirrel, pygmy hawks, etc. So always they think that it is only the animals which are put in IUCN list, and that is where the ambition also comes in. That is where also the ambition comes in few of the candidates, that we will end up learning the entire IUCN list. Now, that is an ambition that I would ask you, I would rather suggest you to keep it in holds, keep it in tracks, because understand that this list, the number of species which are there are significantly immense. For example, I'll show you what was the status as of this year, as replied in the parliament. So 73 species in India are critically endangered. Now, these include 9 species of mammals, 18 species of birds, 26 species of reptiles, 20 amphibians. So this is present only in India, right? So it is up from 47 as compared to 2011. Why? Because there has been significant amount of increased competition, significant amount of degradation, and also fragmentation of habitat. So always advisable that if you have to utilize your time to the maximum proportion, please don't end up learning these species at get-go. So always try to find out the species which have been mentioned in the portion of current affairs. Only those portions should be looked at. You cannot have a goal for yourself that I will learn and keep track of all the 73 species. Let's suppose you are able to memorize. Let's suppose you have put in 1 month of your time, and at the end of 1 month you are able to memorize, let's suppose, all the 73 species. What after that? Now, there also, it is not a guarantee or given thing that UPSC will ask you that where the species is found. You need to be able to keep track of which are the areas that they are found in, which are the types of biodiversity that they rely upon. So you also have to keep a track of their natural cycles, etc. So it is too humongous a task that you will set for yourself, which you will never be able to achieve. So always, for the IUCN list, please only rely on the current affairs. What are the various species which have been in discussion in relevance for the past 12 to 18 months? That will be more than sufficient. Now, IUCN also played a fundamental role in the creation of certain international conventions. For example, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, which we have seen, World Heritage Convention, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, that is CITES, which we will take a look into, and CBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity. Both these conventions will take a detailed look into. Now, in 1980, IUCN published the World Conservation Strategy. Now, this entire slide is relevant for your prelims. Okay, the organizations, the conventions that IUCN is associated with, that is something which becomes relevant for your prelims. Okay, so that world conservation strategy, that helped define the concept of sustainable development, and thereby it shaped the sustainable development agenda. Because when we talk about, and as we will discuss about the Brundtland report going forward, we'll discuss about the Stockholm conference, sustainable development has always been in discussion. That discussion is something which was in a way encouraged right at the time of Stockholm conference itself. But eventually, what is sustainability? Sustainability is when you utilize a particular set of resources in a manner, in such a way that you are using that in a judicious manner, you have significant amount of resources left for the future generation as well. So the entire concept of sustainability is that the resources that you are availing, those resources and the choice of availing of those resources should be available for the future generation as well, without the degradation in quality of the resources, right? So that will happen when you have judicious use, so in majority of the cases, now throughout the 70s and 80s and even through the mid part of 90s, the discussion which captured the entire global imagination was very simple. And that entire discussion and debate was around development versus environment. Even today, you will find that kind of discussion and debate going on. Just a moment. Okay, minor announcement for you guys. So today, the lunch break that you will be having will be from 2:15 to 3:15. Okay, so the timing for the lunch break today will be from 2:15 to 3:15. This is again for your information. So that is, and before that, obviously, I never make you sit for more than 1.5 hours. So I'll take a short break sometime in between and before that, so that you are able to re-energize yourself. But the lunch break will be from 2:15 to 3:15. Okay. So now, after this, here when we talk about and as we continue our discussion here, so basically, Gulam previous para can't understand. So this paragraph are you talking about? So this is very simple, that for all the various different conventions, be it the Ramsar Convention, be it the sites, or be it the CBD, in all these conventions, IUCN plays a very important role, has played an important role in the very formation of these organizations as well. In, for example, in CBD, in the various different frameworks that CBD prepares, in the various different updates that CBD brings about, and also the very creation of that had required a substantial role by the IUCN to be played. Okay, what is role for conversation? It is convention, my dear friend. It is not conversation. It is conventions. So you have international conventions. So establishment of conventions, will come to it. For each one of them in this module itself, we will come to it. What is a convention, etc. Okay, so establishing a convention is when you have many different members, they get together, and these different members, after getting together, let's suppose they take a decision, or in a way, they come across a scenario of how to create a conservation strategy, what is the threats that they face. So all this data is something which is present with the IUCN. IUCN regularly carries out the various different studies. It regularly commissions various different scientific studies and findings. So it is able to furnish that. Okay, convention means practice. Convention is a different thing. It is more or less, yes, but then when we talk about convention, it is not exactly a practice. It is coming together of different parties where they come together, or they strive for the attainment of a larger goal. So that is their aim. Okay. Now, here in 1980, the IUCN was very instrumental in the publishing of the World Conservation Strategy. No, Asif, it is after convention that a protocol comes. So convention is followed by a protocol. We'll come to that, don't worry. So this is instrumental, important for the concept of sustainability. Because when we talk about sustainability, one of the biggest threats and damages which have been caused in the name of economic development has been the damage which has been created to the natural ecosystem. And due to that damage to the natural ecosystem, that is where you have significant number of species, and significant number of species in the sense when we talk about, let's suppose, when we talk about the various species living in forests, etc., many of them have faced extinction because their habitat has been completely destroyed and damaged. So that is also a category here. So that is the role played by IUCN. So these are few of the critically endangered species in India, but always I would suggest that follow the current affairs, addition or removal which has happened in the past year, or removal which has taken place in the past year. Please keep a track of only this. That will be enough for you. Now, when you take a look at the critically endangered species, let's suppose anywhere in India, it is not only sufficient to rectify and mug up only their needs. So any new additions or removal which have happened in the past year, so there you also need to be investigating the regions where they are to be found. Regions where they are to be found. Okay, that also needs to be looked into. So, few of the species, for example, you have Elvira rat. Elvira rat is found in which part of the country? So, Elvira rat is a kind of a rodent which is found in the rocky terrains in the peninsular part of the country, in certain plateau regions around Maharashtra. That is where you'll find these rats. Then you have the Namdafa flying squirrel. Namdafa flying squirrel is again critically endangered to be found. Obviously, the name in itself is foretelling in the Namdafa region of Arunachal Pradesh. Now, Namdafa is also a tiger reserve. That is also a region where you have sufficient amount of tigers now. Then you have a civet species which is nocturnal in nature. It looks like a fox, slightly overgrown fox, and that is the Malabar civet. Now, then you have the rhinos, the Sumatran rhinos, the Javan rhinos, Pondicherry shark. So these are few of the critically endangered. There are much more than that as well. As you can see, mammals, birds, reptiles, all of them are included, but there is no point ratifying and learning all of them. Okay. Now we come to the portion of biodiversity hotspots. So when you encounter the term hotspots, what is the meaning of that? Any place or any region where there is a frequency of, or there's a greater frequency or a greater repetition of an event, that is a hotspot. So biodiversity hotspot. These are the areas where the biodiversity is significantly rich. And not only that, you also have a significant amount of threat that these biodiversities they face. It is not only about the greater amount of biodiversity which is present, but also those areas where the threats are very, very high. That is what is regarded as the biodiversity hotspot. So for example, any region to be regarded as a biodiversity hotspot needs to fulfill two basic criteria. Two basic conditions need to be met. Only then you can declare a region as a biodiversity hotspot. So first of all, they need to contain at least 1,500 species of vascular plants found nowhere else on the earth. That is, 1,500 species of vascular plants should be endemic. Endemic means something which is to be found in that area, not to be found anywhere else. That is what is referred to as the endemic species. Then, what do we mean by vascular plants, by the way? I understand that few of us, we are experts in science here. So what do we understand by vascular plants? No, not local plants. So I hope we are aware that, yes, Ankit, good. Where you have the presence of xylem and phloem, right? The presence of xylem and phloem. Okay, so this is where these plants, they are the more developed or evolved plant species who are able to transmit or move water, food requirements, nourishment requirements through the vessels within their body, plant tissues which are present. So at least 1,500 species of plants should be absolutely endemic, not to be found anywhere else, and would have lost 70% of its primary vegetation, would have faced a threat or an extinction of at least 70% of the primary vegetation naturally found in that area. So that automatically gives you an idea that these will be significantly endangered. Okay, significant amount of threat. Okay, then after that, here around the world, you have 36 areas which qualify as the biodiversity hotspots. And these are not nation-centric. Understand this. These are regions. These are not defined by the national boundaries. Let me clarify that. Many of the times we confuse ourselves between the biodiversity reserves and biodiversity hotspots. Both are very different. These are independent of national boundaries. Okay, these are region specific. Okay, so these are region specific, and the entire purpose of defining them as hotspots is to increase the level of awareness and increase the level of conservation. So declared to increase the level of conservation. Okay, and also awareness. When the awareness will increase, only then the conservation strategies will work. Okay, so and also awareness. So that is what we understand by this biodiversity hotspot. So they represent around 2.4% of the Earth's land surface. So understand this. They will represent a very small area in areas spread across the entirety of the planet. These hotspot regions are not very large, but look at the amount of diversity that is included in that 2.4% of the Earth's land. So you have close to around 43% of the bird, mammal, reptilian, and the amphibian species. They are endemic to this 2.4%. Okay, so around 43% of that is endemic in 2.4. Now here, let us develop a concept further. And I hope we are aware how intricately linked the subject is with the portion of geography. Now, because I see many of the faces who have covered the portion of geography. So here, when I talk about the region of the tropics, let's suppose I talk about the region of the tropics. And then I talk about the temperate zone. Obviously, I hope we have a clarity that polar zone or the polar areas, they won't have that amount of biodiversity. But when I talk about temperate regions, so out of the tropics and the temperate region, where do you think that the biodiversity will be greater? Not the population. I'm talking about diversity. Out of the tropics and temperate, where do you think the diversity will be greater? Good, Saurabh. Pranay, correct. Good. No. Yes. Ankit, Gulam, correct. Now, can you think of the reason why? So basically, the diversity will always be greater in the tropics. Eventually, the population is also greater, but diversity is always higher. High amount of rainfall. But within the tropics, you also have areas of dry conditions. So think about it. Why is it that the diversity is higher? Apply your logic, guys. Temperature, okay, that is a good factor. Then here, more suitable conditions, okay, that we can interlink with the portion of temperature itself. No, grassland will be present in temperate areas itself. Grassland and even the forest, you have the temperate evergreen forest also which are present. So it is not as if forest will only be present in the tropics. So let us take a look at the reasons. Why is it that we have a greater biodiversity in the tropical region? So the reasons for them. so that you don't get confused later on. So what are these reasons about? So the reasons for them are twofold. Understand them. First of all, throughout the year, when we talk about the difference in temperature between the summer and the winter months, the difference in temperature will be greater in the temperate areas or in the tropical areas. What do you think? Where is it that you will find a greater difference of temperature? That winter is much cold, summer is much hot. Where is it that you will find a greater variation in temperature? Always in temperate areas. Whereas in the region of the tropics, you have a consistency of temperature which is maintained. The difference in temperature between the summer and the winter months, that is not very substantial in the region of the tropics. So the species, they always like it. And you have greater number of species which will always follow the conformity that they are not able to regulate. We have seen earlier in the first module itself that you have a larger proportion of species who do not or who are not able to regulate, to simply conform to the changes. So such kinds of species will always like those areas where the temperature range is quite consistent throughout, isn't it? So here, temperature conditions, or rather than temperature conditions, let us have a broader canvas coverage by saying conditions are consistent throughout the year. Okay, so throughout the year, so that means better adaptability. Yes, not only low diurnal range, but also not only about diurnal range, but also about the annual range of temperature. So it is in both aspects. So I hope you are able to understand how this will impact the biodiversity. So if the temperature variation is less, so the species who are not having a greater amount of thermal tolerance, they will be able to survive pretty well. Now, after that, another reason. Now we do know that the planet goes through the various after every few thousand years, the planet does go through various events of freezing and melting. Now, that is what we refer to as the ice age and the interglacial period. Now, whenever the planet goes through an ice age, for example, whenever the planet encounters an ice age, it is the temperate areas which are completely covered in ice. Almost much of the temperate areas, they will be significantly covered in ice. They will be frozen. Whereas the tropics, they remain ice-free. So while they will experience a rise and fall in sea levels between these ice ages, but not in terms of the conditions won't be changing very drastically. So even when we consider the historical aspect, so those regions where the conditions have remained consistent for thousands and thousands of years, obviously, it is in those areas that you will observe or experience greater amount of diversity. I hope this is understood. So the tropics have experienced a consistency of temperature and other conditions through the history, the geological history of the planet. So there they have had a significantly consistent temperature and other conditions which have prevailed, and that has allowed for greater biodiversity to happen. I hope this is clear. So these are your, now by the way, does that mean that there won't be a biodiversity hotspot in the temperate region? Absolutely not. You will have the biodiversity hotspot which is present even in the areas of the temperate region. Okay, so for example, take the case of New Zealand. In that area also you have biodiversity hotspot. So biodiversity hotspot, while it is majorly dominant in the tropics, it is also to be found in the temperate region. While majorly being dominant in the tropics, is also to be found in temperate areas. Okay. Okay. Now, after this, these are the biodiversity hotspots that lie or come across India. So first of all, you don't have to learn these biodiversity hotspots. Please don't learn this. If any biodiversity hotspot, let's say it gets into conversation due to the portion of current affairs, that is a different matter altogether. But please don't make it a goal that I will learn all the 36 names. I understand the urge that you will have, but try to curb it up. So you have 4 different biodiversity hotspots which are present or spread across the country. So they are also spread in the surrounding regions, but some part of those hotspots will also lie over India. So which are those? You have the Himalayan hotspot. Himalayan hotspot. Then you have the Indo-Burma. Then you have, for example, the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. And then you will have the Sundaland. So when we talk about the Himalayan hotspot, it represents an alpine ecosystem or a high altitude ecosystem which is present. That is what we refer to as by the Himalayan hotspot, the high altitude ecosystem which is present. So here you will find, for example, brown bears. In certain cases, you will also find the snow leopard to be spread over. You will find orchids, ferns. These are the species that you will call lichens. In large variety, you will find lichens, greater diversity of them. So all of these are present in very large varieties. You have few of the medicinal plants which are to be found, which have recently been discovered in the region of Himalayas, and they have been put into the portion of the critically endangered, one of them, which has found to be a kind of a natural detoxicant, and it can carry out the natural detoxification of your blood, etc. So that is included in the case of the Himalayan hotspot. So this is where you have the high altitude hotspot, altitude habitat. Okay, and critical plants, ferns, then lichens, orchids, etc. Then when we consider the Indo-Burma hotspot. Now, Indo-Burma hotspot is a densely forested ecosystem. So you have many of the species which migrate and come back within that particular ecosystem, many of the species. So that is a densely, so here also, in the case of densely forested ecosystem, which is the kind of species that start to dominate, you will have the bird species, the arboreal species, right? And also many different types of monkeys. Then you have the many different types of apes, etc. So that is what is a dominant factor in this particular region as well. Okay. Rhino is also to be found there, but rhino traditionally, rhino traditionally would be spread. If I can show you the entire regional spread, at one point of time, we had the entire rhino stretch from here till here. This was the entire range of rhinos. And because they like the marshy conditions of terrain, that is what they would favor. But due to the deforestation, the massive deforestation which has happened, there is a fragmentation of that which has happened. So in some areas here, it has been restricted. In northern portion of Bihar, some parts of Bengal, it has completely been extinguished. And now the rhinos are restricted only in these two stretches. For example, you have the Katanya Ghat Wildlife, then you have the Tarai Elephant Reserve, the latest one, addition to the elephant reserve, that has got some rhinos. So the immediate or the eventual aim is to increase these rhino range areas. Okay. Macaques are also found in large quantities. In the case of macaques, will be found in the region of Indo-Burma and also in the case of Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. By the way, in this year's, whenever, I don't know how many of you are interested in appearing for forest services. Ideally, you should be. It is a very good service to join. It is a very nice role to play in the case of, so you will be taken care of by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And in the interview for the IFOS examination, these types of questions are oftentimes asked. That which are the areas where you will find greater amount of ape species or macaques? Where is it that you will find the hornbills? So hornbills, I hope we are able to understand what are hornbills. These are the species of birds, and they are typically to be found in the region of Western Ghats, right? Yes. Is it similar to UPSC, the forest services? So you apply along with UPSC. You apply it along with the same form. The form is the same. It is first you have to check your eligibility, whether you are eligible, and then after that, the prelims examination is the same. The cutoff for the prelims for forest is much higher, around 10 to 15 marks, or sometimes even more than that. That is, so if the prelims cutoff goes for civil services, it goes at 85. For the forest services, it will be somewhere in the range of 98 to 102. So if you score that, then the mains examination is where you will have to choose two different options, but very basic and simple questions are asked. Very basic and simple questions are asked. Okay. Yes, Nagaland, the Hornbill Festival is there. Yes. So then you have the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. This is also a densely forested ecosystem. There also you have the. Okay, is the video available for everyone? Kakashan, you have twice raised this doubt, and for both the times I'm telling you, there is no issue with the video for the rest of them. Either you are keeping it on mute and simply typing it up, that, okay, let's see what happens. But then if you are attentive, please refresh. There is no video which is hidden. Okay? It is only after that confirmation that I ever proceed in the session. So then, Western Ghats and Sri Lanka, this is also a dense forest ecosystem. Dense forest ecosystem. And here also, the same kind of species diversity that you find in the region of Indo-Burma, it is in this area where the population, the diversity in terms of reptiles, for example, here near the region of Mangalore, you have one of the world's largest cobra protected area, where you have a particular protected area only for Indian species for cobra. So there, the amount of reptiles that you find in this area, anybody who has visited either of these, you would, or if you live in these areas, you would always attest to the fact that the number of reptiles and their sheer diversity is so very huge because of the ideal conditions which are present. You have forest ecosystem. So as a dense forest, in the dense forest, what will you have? A lot of various different leaves, etc., which will keep on falling. So as a result of that, you will have a lot of insects. Wherever you have a lot of insects, you will have rodents which will start coming in, that is rats, mice, etc., frogs. Now these are the ones which serve as the ideal food for many of the smaller snakes, the non-venomous snakes, and these non-venomous snakes, in many of the cases, they are consumed by the larger species such as the cobra. Cobra, I hope you are aware, can consume the other snakes as well, and that is something that they prey upon. Now, then you have the Sundaland. Sundaland hotspot in India. Now, even though it spreads over to the region of Indonesia and these South Asian regions as well, in India, it is restricted to the Great Nicobar region, not even Andaman. Great Nicobar region. It is here in the Great Nicobar region where you find significant amount of coral reefs, diversity in coral reefs. You will also find the dugong species that we have talked about quite frequently. So all those various species you find here. It is this Great Nicobar ecosystem which had faced where you have the entire project of developing the Great Nicobar project. Now that Great Nicobar project is deemed to be developed in the Nicobar Islands in order to develop a township, a kind of a strategic port for transshipment of goods, and also some of the power generation facilities, for example, defense facilities, an airport which can serve for the civilians as well as for the defense personnel. So that has hit a roadblock because the environmental clearance which has been provided, there have been questions raised that how clearance was provided so quickly, and in order to, so there was a stay which was imposed on that Great Nicobar project that it will damage the ecosystem there. So what did the government do? You have the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill of 2023. So that will, in a way, pave the way for creation of infrastructure in that area as well. So that is why the legislations which keep on getting passed, there is always a relevance for the examination. So then we will come over to the portion of the biodiversity heritage sites. We'll take a break before that. A 10 minutes break, I think, would suffice because we will take a lunch break at 2:15. So let's take a break for around 10 minutes and then we'll be back. I'll keep it at this slide. We'll take a break and then we'll be back. And after the break, we will try to discuss some of the PYQs there. Okay. A confirmation about the audio, please, guys. If the audio is clear and available, kindly confirm the same. Thank you. Lunch break will be at 2:15, 2:15 to 3:15. Okay. So now we move ahead with the aspect of the biodiversity heritage site. Now this is something which is India specific. Okay. This is not a biodiversity hotspot. This is not a biodiversity reserve. This is a different thing altogether. So this is again India specific. So here, these are the areas. These are well-defined areas that are unique or that represent unique and ecologically fragile ecosystems with a significantly high amount of diversity of wild and domesticated species, presence of rare and threatened species, and also the keystone species. So these are declared as per the Biodiversity Act of 2002, because the various different protection areas and the protected areas, as we will take a look at it later on as well. Now majority of them, they are under or they come under the provision of the Wildlife Act 1972. But the biodiversity heritage sites, they come under the provisions of the Wildlife, or rather the Biodiversity Act of 2002. Biodiversity Act of 2002. Okay, so that is included in this. So here they are provided as per the provisions of section 37(1) of the Biodiversity Act. And here understand, the state government is the one which will declare. So the state government may, from time to time, in consultation with the various different local bodies, that is the local bodies, that is your panchayat and the various different, even the rural local bodies, urban local bodies in certain cases, the gram sabhas in certain cases. So after consultation with those local bodies, that is when they notify it in the official gazette, and that those are the areas of biodiversity importance. So what are the characteristics as per which the biodiversity heritage sites are declared overall? So if you take a look at the characteristic, so areas which have the presence of natural, semi-natural, or even artificial habitats. So it is not as if only natural habitats or natural ecosystems will be prevalent. Those areas, for example, let's suppose, which have significant amount of natural diversity, and along with that, let's suppose there is also a significant presence of the human-made or human cultural aspect for that. So all of those will come under the category. So they need to, that entire site needs to collectively house a large variety of living species. So areas where there's a large amount of domesticated biodiversity present, domesticated, okay, as well as representative agro ecosystems where this diversity is sustained by the ongoing agricultural practices. So you have the eco-farming, farming methodologies which are used, all of them will come under this category. So important cultural spaces like the sacred groves. Right now, sacred groves, they are present across the interior of the country, from Andhra Pradesh to Telangana to Jharkhand to Odisha to Chhattisgarh. So these sacred groves, they need significant amount of conservation, not only because of the biodiversity that they end up representing and housing within themselves, but also the sheer scale of the man-environment relationship that they are a mascot of, that they end up representing, being a mascot of. So as well as other sizable community preserved areas, so are regions that are noteworthy for the perspective of biodiversity. So urban green spaces, wetlands. So these criteria you need to be aware of when you take a look into the aspect. So here, when you take a look into the aspect of, let's say, for the prelims examination. So important for prelims. This is something which is relevant and important for your prelims examination, where you will be required to talk about that whether or a multi-statement kind of a question can be framed from here, that these are the conditions or only these areas can be fulfilled as or required as a biodiversity heritage site, etc. So those can be the conditions. Then, as much as possible, locations which are not earlier or protected or provided protection under the Wildlife Act. So Wildlife Act, under these provisions, you end up creating conservation measures and conservation areas. So you have conservation areas under this. So for example, you will come across national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, then marine protected areas. They will come under the ambit. So these are already going to provide you a kind of significant amount of conservation, and these are as per the provisions of the Wildlife Act. So already these areas are being protected. So those regions which are not protected by these, ideally the effort is that those areas should be brought under conservation. But then it is not a necessary requirement. It is not as if in an area which is aligned under a national park, you cannot have a biodiversity heritage site. It can also happen. So areas where seasonal migrant animals can find aquatic or terrestrial habitats for feeding or nesting. So these can talk about, here you can talk about, let's say, urban wetlands, for example, then backwaters. Right. So in these areas also, you can have a biodiversity heritage site. Areas that the Forest Department's research wing maintains as preservation plots, where research can be carried out. Now, research in these areas encompasses what? So when you carry out research in these protected areas or in the forested region, so the research is basically to understand their ecosystem. Research is carried out to be able to understand what are the various linkages which exist. So that is where the research factor comes in. So those areas can also be included, and conservation zone for the medicinal plants. So example, you have the Nallur Tamarind Grove in Karnataka. It is situated in the outskirts of Bangalore, that is in the Devanahalli region of Bangalore. So it is popularly believed to be a relic of the Chola dynasty that ruled nearly 800 years ago. So this tamarind grove, here you have a large density of trees, and also along with that, this is the first biodiversity heritage site of our country. This is something which is important for your prelims again. Important for prelims. Okay, so when we take the case of the Nallur Tamarind Grove, so here you will also find a cultural landscape which requires conservation. You have very ancient, or the representative of the Chola dynasty itself, you have the presence of very unique kind of sculptures and very unique kind of places of worship which have also been preserved or conserved in these areas. Then another example you can take of the Hobrekan region in Chikmagalur. So in Chikmagalur in Karnataka, so that is Hobrekan. So this area has a Shola vegetation. Shola vegetation is basically a kind of a forested landscape that you find in the southern part of the country, primarily in the Nilgiris, where you have a kind of an evergreen system due to the high amount of moisture available at a greater altitude. So that is the shola vegetation. So here you have the shola vegetation and grassland with several floral species which are unique and have a lot of medicinal value. So Hogrekan also serves as a wildlife corridor. Now, what is the concept of wildlife corridor? So we do know that the species, they end up migrating over larger landscapes in order to get an availability of the food, for availability of adequate conditions, water availability in the drier seasons. So let's suppose you have a habitat or a forested region here. Let's suppose you have another forested region here. Now the species, oftentimes they will end up moving in between these areas. Now there is always a kind of a wild patch or a kind of an ecosystem patch that these species will end up availing. So if this is one of the habitats, so let's name this as habitat 1. Let's name this as habitat 2. This is your wildlife corridor. For the free movement of species from one region to another, so that they can have an extended range. It is when these wildlife corridors are further encroached upon by the anthropogenic activities, that is when the man-animal conflict is the highest. It is in these wildlife corridors that you will experience here. This is where maximum man-animal conflict is witnessed. Okay, you have the entire list that you can access again at WII Invest. This particular site is something that I had suggested and recommended to you for everyone interested in keeping a track of the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, tiger reserves, wetland ecosystems, biodiversity heritage sites, marine protected areas. All that is available. This is a government website. So if you are interested in that list, you will find that. But here again, I would suggest to you that oftentimes, other than the first biodiversity heritage site, the other biodiversity heritage sites, if they have been in news, if they have been in discussion in some part of the past year or in the duration of around 12 to 18 months, that becomes relevant. So only track the portion of current affairs. Track the newer additions and the regions where they are present. Okay, regions where you'll find them. Then we come across what is referred to as mega diverse countries. Now, this again stems from the fact of, or from the need of an urgency of conservation to be carried on. So when we talk about a country and a biodiversity, so we already have a biodiversity hotspot which raises awareness for conservation. But there's a problem when it comes to the conservation with biodiversity hotspot. The problem or the issue which arises is that, for example, let's consider Indo-Burma landscape, Indo-Burma hotspot. Now, in the Indo-Burma hotspot, that encompasses 2 countries, right? Now, multiple different countries or terrains are covered in this. So there is no fixed accountability that who will carry out conservation, who will be accountable for conservation. It can also happen, for example, let's suppose there is a significant amount of poaching of elephants in that region. So Myanmar can always turn up and say that India is irresponsible, I am being responsible. And India can also turn up and say, look, we are taking care with adequate measures. It is Myanmar and on the side of Myanmar where there is an increased amount of stress. So that can always come up. So that is why, in order to raise a larger scale of awareness and also in order to increase the accountability for the process of conservation, you have the declaration of countries in themselves as mega diverse countries. That these are the countries where the diversity is very high. So this is a term which is used to refer to the world's top biodiversity rich countries. The diversity, the species diversity, in that the genetic diversity is very high. So in this case, species and genetic diversity is very high. Okay. Now, this country-focused method, it raises the national awareness for biodiversity. So if, let's suppose, India is declared and India is a mega-diverse country. So if we consider India as a mega-diverse country, now in that case, obviously, there will be a greater national awareness. There will be a greater national effort to preserve that biodiversity, to prevent the biodiversity from facing the various different threats, isn't it? So that is where it outperforms the objective of a biodiversity hotspot. So for biodiversity conservation in nations with higher amount of diversity and with many species which are unique, which are endemic, these are your mega-diverse regions of the world. As you can see, and this is something that I always ask people to look into, you will observe that the entire region of Europe has not been included. These are the so-called champions of climate change, the so-called champions of natural conservation. But in their own landscape, they have gotten rid of the biodiversity. So this is like, I will do whatever I want in my area, but you should take care of the biodiversity. You should not carry out anything where the biodiversity is threatened, let alone what I am doing in my own backyard. That is where I'm not accountable. So that is the ideal case of hypocritical approach for the conservation of biodiversity. So there in the region of Europe, they have already managed to put into extinction and clean out a large portion of biodiversity, which would at one point of time roam freely in this area. So here, what are the conditions required for a country to be declared as a mega diverse country? What are the conditions required? So first, they should have at least 5,000 of the world's plants as endemics to be found only in the region and nowhere else. To be found only in that region and not to be found anywhere else. Okay, they need to have a marine ecosystem within its borders. So if you have a marine ecosystem, obviously the amount of diversity, the amount of functionality within the ecosystems that you can have, that will be significantly greater. So this is an important portion. All the criteria are relevant for your prelims. Important for prelims. Then other secondary criteria which can also be taken, for example, the endemism of the various other kinds of animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, species diversity, higher level diversity in terms of the various different organisms, ecosystem diversity, functional diversity. So all those various diversities, they are also kept in mind. But the primary two of them are these two. These need to be fulfilled for any particular country. Only then will it be declared as a mega diverse country. Then we come to the portion of extinction. So extinction is what? When we say a species has gone extinct, means that species is not to be found anymore. Right? So that is what is extinction. Now, species which have come into existence across this planet, majority of them, more than 90%, more than around 99% of them, they have been extinct as well. There have been many different species which have been created long before the humans came into existence, and they went extinct long before the humans came into existence. So there have been various different stages. So as the conditions change, as the evolution happens, there is also creation, or in a way evolution, of a newer set of species. That is what is referred to as speciation. So when we say speciation, it is about adding species into the ecosystem. So speciation, it is a continuous process. Is a continuous process. Now that speciation is a result of evolution and also changing environment. So that is where you have many of the new species which get created, which do come into existence. So over the history of the earth, so when we talk about the existence of or biodiversity at any particular point of time, it is a direct correlation between the speciation, the rate of speciation, and the rate of extinction. That how many newer species are coming into existence and how many of the older species they are going extinct. So the species getting removed, the species getting added, it is a difference between two, and that is where you will observe the net addition. So over the history of earth, in excess of 90% of the species, or close to 99%, are estimated to have gone extinct. Now there have been various different sudden changes which have happened across the earth's ecosystem going back hundreds of millions of years. So for example, there have been various different phases of sudden oxygenation, there have been phases of intense volcanic activity, there have been even events of asteroid collision. So they have at one point of time and at one go, they have managed to eradicate large number of species at one go. So that is what we refer to as mass extinction. Where at one go, majority of the species which will be found in a region, when they have suddenly become extinct, that is what we refer to as mass extinction. So compared to the duration of life on Earth, no genus survived for very long. The longest lived genus or species, they persisted for about 160 million years, or only around 5% of the history of life. So when we say a mass extinction, it is a time period in which a large percentage of all known species at a particular point of time, they go extinct or they are completely wiped out. Now, throughout the history of the planet, we have experienced 5 major phases of mass extinction. The 6th major phase of mass extinction is something that we are experiencing now. Right? So in all these cases of 5 major mass extinctions which have happened earlier, the last major mass extinction happened at a time when the dinosaurs were wiped out. So at that particular point of time, you had the conditions which changed so suddenly and so rapidly because of the collision of an asteroid with the planet. That is when the conditions changed very drastically and rapidly at the same time. So in many of the cases, so how do we get to know that a mass extinction has actually taken place? How do we get to know about that? So by study of the fossils and the remains of the fossils. So when we talk about, let's say, the fossils here. Now, when we have the paleontologists with the help of the carbon dating, they are able to determine the age of the fossils. And that is how they are able to deduce what is it that the animals would consume, what is it that the animals would have as their diet, where is it that they would have lived. All of that deduction is made accordingly. Now, when you start carrying out these studies, you will find that suddenly there is a period after which, let's suppose, the fossils of a certain species of animals are not to be found anymore. Right? For example, take the case of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, why I'm taking the repeated case of dinosaurs is because most of us from our childhood days, dinosaurs is one of those species, along with the woolly mammoth, etc., which has captured our imagination quite vividly. Now here, these dinosaurs, they lived on the planet for more than 100 billion years. Now, these particular dinosaurs, you will find multiple different varieties of them. Recent findings have also indicated the presence of very large dinosaur fossils, even to be found in the deserts of Jaisalmer in Rajasthan. So all these dinosaurs, they were spread across the planet, and they were spread also in terms of a time period. It is not as if all the dinosaur fossils are of the same time age. They are spread. But nowhere will you be able to find a dinosaur fossil, which is, let's say, younger than 65 million years. So then, once you study these fossils, you can come to the conclusion that around 65 million years back, the dinosaurs would have gone extinct. If the dinosaurs would have lived after 65 or even after that, we would have found their fossils somewhere or the other. So there is no fossil to be found. That means they have gone extinct. So you have various different phases of mass extinction. In many of the cases, we don't know the reasons why that mass extinction happened. We can only take a guess. So the first major mass extinction which happened was close to around 440 to 450 million years ago, where close to around 60 to 70% of all the existing species at that point of time, they went extinct. The possible reason? Continental drift. And continental drift means the continents have simply changed their position. And when they have changed their position, there will be a substantial amount of climate change. So due to lack of adaptability. And obviously, the adaptability factor has also evolved with the passage and the period of time, where now you have many species who are able to adapt in a much better way. So that adaptability, due to reduction or the reduced amount of adaptability, many of these species, they have been found to go extinct. Then you have the second major mass extinction, which was almost around 75 million years later. And this mass extinction happened close to around 375 million years ago. Here again, majority of the species, 70% of the existing. So imagine if in today's dimension, 70% of all the species they have gone extinct. Means what? You will not find many varieties of trees, many varieties of plants and animals and birds that you encounter on a daily basis. They will not be found anymore. So that is where here the probable cause, we don't know the exact cause. With a greater amount of research, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, we will be knowing much better. But as of now, we don't know that much because there is not a significant amount of evidences to indicate what really happened. But the probable cause could be caused due to lack of oxygen in the oceans, quick cooling of the air temperature, right? Quick cooling of air temperature, possible volcanic eruptions, or even meteor strikes. Now, if you have any of these, that is volcanic eruption, or let's say frequent meteoric strikes, it will create a huge plume of smoke that can block the availability of sunlight. When the sunlight is blocked, then what will happen to the plant species? Their population will be lesser. And obviously the producers, they are now by this point of time, around 375 million years ago, we did not have many of the large forest areas that you see. Forest areas were not developed significantly. That started developing close to around 350 million years back. And that is when large scale forest development started happening. Okay, many of the large species of animals, they were not to be found. Then the third major mass extinction, around 250 million years ago, at that point of time, almost 96% of all the known species on the planet, they went extinct. Then fourth major mass extinction, around 200 million years ago, suspected cause, major volcanic activity with basalt flooding. Basalt flooding, something that we observe even in the region of the Deccan Plateau. That is where you have the basaltic lava, the basaltic magma which starts spreading. That is what is basalt flooding. So here, sudden, it would cause global climate change, changing pH value of the ocean, sea level of the oceans, change because of that. And the fifth major mass extinction, which was created only around 65 million years back. So observe, every 100 to 175 to 150 million years, there has been a major mass extinction event. Okay, so this fifth major mass extinction, when it happened, that happened due to the asteroid impact. A large asteroid, it struck the region around Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico area, and that created such a huge amount of impact, because these large asteroids, when they strike, obviously they come with an incredible amount of heat. The heat produced is very high. So majority of the heat is so very high for in the temporary duration of a small time. The temperature goes so high in that localized region that majority of that asteroid almost vaporizes. The land in that area almost vaporizes. It is as if you have thousands of these hydrogen nuclear bombs that you drop at the same time. So that much amount of energy is produced. So immediately it would kill all the biodiversity present in a large area. Okay, and then you have had the subsequent impacts and the subsequent effects, where you also had the impact of a large dust or large-scale dust smoke which was created, and that dust smoke eventually again prevented the availability of sunlight, reduced the photosynthetic reactive radiation available for the plants, reduced the rate of photosynthesis. Many of the plants, they ceased to exist anymore, and they were pushed into extinction. Okay, and when the plants were pushed into extinction, many of the species of dinosaurs, etc. So the global climate change which was induced by the asteroid impact, that also had a significant role to play. Global climate change was induced. Okay. Now, you have, however, the presence of one of the species which has managed to survive all the various different phases of extinction. And that is what is referred to as a tardigrade or water bear. Now, it is microscopic in size, right? So once we got to know that it is one of the species which is very, very old. So what did we do? What did we try to do? Immediately, we tried to kill it. That let's see how it dies, so that we understand that why it survived. So we have even managed to send the species as an experimental basis into space. There also it managed to survive. How? Because this has got a unique ability to shut down all the various different biological activities and processes that it encounters. Whenever it encounters a tough outside surrounding, it can close all the bodily requirements and still manage to survive. So it can survive in temperatures as low as minus 200 degrees Celsius without food and water, even extreme radiation of space for over 100 years without any evident discomfort. So that can be done by shutting down its body's requirement. Now, presently, we are going through a phase which is referred to as the sixth mass extinction. And that sixth mass extinction is human-induced. Human-induced. Where, by our own activities, we are creating a circumstance or a scenario where basically you have a significant degradation of the habitat, fragmentation of the habitat, and the existing quality of the habitats, they are getting polluted, climate change is being exaggerated, so majority of the species, they have gone extinct. So current crisis is almost caused entirely by humans, and 99% of the currently threatened species are at risk because of human activities. So in the past 500 years, we know of approximately 1,000 species that have gone extinct. So imagine the number of species that have gone extinct that we are not even aware of, that maybe we'll be aware of by studying the fossils of them some 50 or 100 years down the line. So this is one of the gravest threats that the biodiversity has faced ever since the extinction of dinosaurs. Okay, so we'll carry on further with the aspect of international conventions and organizations. We'll take a lunch break now. So we'll convene at around 3:15. Okay, take a lunch break.